The early 1920s were looking to be a very unstable time. A decade earlier, the world's most powerful navies had been the Royal Navy in first place by a fairly long distance, followed by the Kaiserliche Marine, sometimes known as the High Seas Fleet, then the US Navy, then France, Russia, and Japan, all roughly at about the same level, depending on what you rated as more important or less, and everyone else considerably further back still. Now, that naval order had almost entirely turned on its head. Germany no longer had a navy to compete with even in the third tier. Russia was in the middle of a revolution that had sidelined its navy for the most part and left it to rot, or occasionally randomly catch fire. France was completely broke and scrapping ships as fast as it possibly could. The US Navy and the Japanese Navy had taken the chance offered by minimal naval involvement in the war to produce new and powerful vessels, and the Royal Navy, with a general but not complete pause on capital ship construction during World War I, was rapidly divesting itself of large numbers of now obsolete vessels, including many that hadn't even seen out 2 decades of service. This left a dangerous balance. The USA had decided, mid-1910s, that it wanted to be the top naval power, and its ability to build modern capital ships throughout that period had allowed it to, roughly, catch up with the Royal Navy in terms of modern battleships, a position the Royal Navy hadn't been party to in over a century. Japan also wanted to assert itself and was rather worried about its primary competitor suddenly being so eager to go on a building spree. The Royal Navy, for its part, was looking to retain its own dominant position, but was part of a nation that had spent practically all of its money on the recent global war, and its primary competitor was now the nation that it actually paid most of that money to. As a result, a rather large naval arms race was brewing. The United States was constructing 16 new capital ships, all of which were armed with 16-inch guns. The Japanese were building 6, having just completed 2, and they'd ordered 4 more. The British had just finished building 1, cancelled 3 others, had just ordered 4 more, and were poised to order another 4. On top of that, everyone was working frantically on what the next generation design was going to be so that they could get that ordered in 1922 or 1923. And that's just capital ships, never mind the cruisers, destroyers, and a few rather bizarre submarines that were under construction. But each of these 3 navies faced some rather major issues at home. Japan, for instance, wanted to play at the top level, but its economy simply couldn't support these efforts long term. For context, the highest level of expenditure on the Royal Navy during World War I had been approximately 11% of the overall government budget. Pre-war, with slightly less emphasis on the army and of course the Air Force not actually existing, it had been about 13% of national budget spending. Japan was now spending 32% of its budget on the Navy. The US was now spending about 11% of its budget on the Navy, and in 1920-21 the UK was spending about 8% of its budget. Clearly, the Japanese expenditure was unsustainable, but they weren't the only ones in trouble. The US Congress had been complaining very loudly pre-war about authorizing naval budgets less than 1/5 of what the US Navy was now asking for, and with the war over, a lot of congressmen were screaming to the heavens about the amount of money that they were being asked to pay out. The US had also gone through an election where the outward-looking Woodrow Wilson had been replaced with a new administration that was decidedly more isolationist and didn't quite have the same drive towards being the biggest navy on the planet. In the UK, the largest issue was their colossal war debt. And the UK was, in a stunning and exceptionally rare display of long-term political thinking, actually paying down the debt with remarkable speed. Later allegations that the UK was completely and utterly broke and couldn't afford to build their capital ships are actually completely spurious. The total amount estimated to fund the laying down of 4 capital ships per year, which would mean a sustained 12 capital ships at some stage of construction or fitting out in any given year, would amount to less than 1/3 of the amount that the UK was reducing its debt by per year, not counting interest payments and other debt-related payments, etc., and the existing naval budget. However, the government would rather prefer to pay the debt down rather quickly, and so it was looking to cut naval estimates as a result. There was also a rather large elephant in the room. A lot of people looked at the last big naval arms race and considered it to be a major contributor to the outbreak of what at the time was being termed the Great War. It didn't take a genius to work out that two powers, ostensibly striving for naval supremacy in a building race, would either come to blows within the space of a decade, or else they'd call it quits further down the line, with colossal amounts of money spent and a massive maintenance and upkeep bill being the only things they had left to show for all the effort. Thus, at the end of 1921, partly to try and sort things out in a way that wouldn't lead to another massive destructive war, and partly because there were some indications that Britain, in light in part of Admiral Jellicoe's report, was planning its own conference, the US proposed a conference on global disarmament to be held in Washington, D.C. This would actually result in a number of treaties being signed, but the only one we're concerned with at this point is the Five-Power Naval Treaty, also known as the Washington Naval Treaty. Going into it, each of the powers had very different aims. The US was primarily driven by a desire to be able to return to the more isolationist outlook that it was now facing courtesy of the change in leadership following the last set of elections we mentioned earlier, and also they would rather like to break up the Anglo-Japanese alliance, which prevented the US from exerting more overt influence over the Japanese in the Pacific, and it offered Britain overall superiority in times of war, even if the US Navy could match or slightly exceed the Royal Navy's own strength, because it would bring its ally in. The Japanese wanted to try and leverage their way into the Great Powers Club and sit at the top table. The British wanted to preserve their top spot without having to pay for another expensive arms race. The other two participants were France and Italy. The French wanted to be able to renew their navy at some point down the line, but not right now, because they weren't so much short of a few francs as really scrabbling in down the back of the sofa for a few remaining centimes. France was properly broke. A treaty that paused everything, at least for a while, would give them time to gather their breath and rebalance their budget. Meanwhile, the Italians were looking at a chance to bring themselves up to parity with the French. There was an opportunity for other naval powers to put forward their own cases, but most of the others were either unwilling or unable to attend when it came to nations like Russia, or had navies too small to bother agreeing to limit much of anything, since any limit that might be agreed would be much higher than what they'd be able to afford anyway. There were a couple of exceptions to these broadly. Navies such as the Australian and Canadian forces, which by the letter of the conference terms could have been represented individually by themselves, but instead chose to have their interests represented by the UK collectively. This was partially pragmatism. At this point, neither country was fully independent, and it was likely that any separate Royal Canadian or Royal Australian Navy would be seen by the US as effectively part of the Royal Navy, and then used to try and argue the Royal Navy's size down to below that of the US Navy, so that any obvious Royal Navy, Royal Canadian Navy and Royal Australian Navy alliance wouldn't overwhelm the US. And it was also partly a show of political unity, and ultimately also partially because neither power especially wanted a navy with entire battle squadrons at their beck and call at this point. The opening offer from the Americans called for the cancellation of all currently building or planned capital ships, with a 10-year moratorium on building new ones. Existing ships would be pared down with capital ship ratios based on tonnage at a 5-5-3, 1.75, 1.75 basis, with the US and UK respectively having equal-sized capital ship fleets, Japan 3/5 of that, and France and Italy each 1.75 of that number. Cruiser and destroyer tonnage was likewise to be limited using the same ratios. This immediately caused a lot of arguments. The Japanese had calculated they needed 70% of the fleet strength of the US Navy to defeat it in a defensive engagement. Apart from anything else, they were hoping they'd have to face off against the US Pacific and Atlantic fleets separately. The proposal the Americans had put forward had given them 60%, which they saw as too little. The Royal Navy had plans to have 3 major fleets, at home, in the Mediterranean, and out in the Far East, and the proposed limits would not allow any of these to be maintained in any credible strength. Despite their lack of money, the French didn't like being pushed down to the third tier and having to be equal to the Italians, since after all, everyone knows cheese goes on top of pasta and cheese goes on top of pizza, not the other way around. The initial French counter-proposal would have given them a fleet slightly larger than Japan's, although with no comment about where they were going to find the money to pay for all of that. The only people who were vaguely happy with the idea were obviously the Americans, because they were the ones who proposed it, and the Italians, who were mainly enjoying the look on the faces of the French delegation as they had to consider the idea of the Italians being their equals, at least at sea. And that was before you got into the actual restrictions on tonnage and armament, together with what this would mean for the various navies. The Japanese and the Americans had both completed, or near completed, 16-inch armed ships. For the Japanese Navy, the Mutsu, built by public subscription, was of a particular concern. For the British, this meant that the US and Japanese navies could potentially have better armed and more modern capital ships, as they had no 16-inch armed ships anywhere near completion. The G3s had barely even been started, whereas the Japanese would have a force composed entirely of 16-inch battleships, 14-inch battleships with 12 guns, and 14-inch armed battle cruisers, whilst the US Navy would have 16-inch armed ships, plus most of the rest of the battle line armed with 12 14-inch guns apiece, with the remaining ships also having 14-inch guns, aside from a handful of older 12-inch armed ships. Whilst the Royal Navy would have a decent 15-inch armed battle line, a large portion would be older ships with 13.5-inch guns. Although, on the other hand, there was the 42,000-ton Hood sitting there, well in excess of any of the proposed limits on individual capital ship displacement. The initial proposal on cruiser limitations, by setting tonnage based on the same ratios, was almost immediately shut down by both the UK and France, both of which had large colonial empires, for which they felt a large number of cruisers were needed, well in excess of the proposed ratio limitations. Given their experiences with the U-boats, the British wanted submarines to be scrapped and banned entirely. But precisely because of the U-boats' effectiveness, everybody else disagreed, and thus began several months of negotiations, arguments, bargains, and counter-proposals, with the Americans doing their best to spy on everybody else's communications home to give them some leverage and advantage at the table, enjoying some particular success in keeping an eye on the Japanese delegation's communications. Early 1922 rolled around, and a lot of the original proposals had either been dropped or radically rewritten, but the treaty was finally signed in February 1922, and then had to go through about a year and a half of ratification. To more fully explain what the outcome was, how it got there, and who cheated on what clauses, we'll go through the treaty's primary sections and look at each of them in turn. Article 1 was basically, we all agree to this treaty, so much for that. Articles 2 through 6, however, covered battleships, as follows. Forgive the legalese, but it is how it is written. Article 2. The contracting powers may retain, respectively, the capital ships which are specified in Chapter 2, Part 1, on the coming into force of the present treaty, but, subject to the following provisions of this article, all other capital ships built or building of the United States, the British Empire, and Japan shall be disposed of as prescribed in Chapter 2, Part 2. In addition to the capital ships specified in Chapter 2, Part 1, the United States may complete or retain 2 ships of the West Virginia class, now under construction. That's what we would consider to be the Colorado class. On completion of these 2 ships, the North Dakota and Delaware shall be disposed of as prescribed in Chapter 2, Part 2. The British Empire may, in accordance with the replacement table in Chapter 2, Part 3, construct 2 new capital ships not exceeding 35,000 tons or 35,560 metric tons standard displacement each. On the completion of the said 2 ships, the Thunderer, King George V, Ajax, and Centurion shall be disposed of as prescribed in Chapter 2, Part 2. Article 3. Subject to the provisions of Article 2, the contracting powers shall abandon their respective capital shipbuilding programs, and no new capital ships shall be constructed or acquired by any of the contracting powers except replacement tonnage, which may be constructed or acquired as specified in Chapter 2, Part 3. Ships which are replaced in accordance with Chapter 2, Part 3 shall be disposed of as prescribed in Part 2 of that chapter. Article 4. The total capital ship replacement tonnage for each of the contracting powers shall not exceed, in standard displacement, for the United States, 525,000 tons, for the British Empire, 525,000 tons, for France, 175,000 tons, for Italy, 175,000 tons, and for Japan, 315,000 tons. Article 5. No capital ship exceeding 35,000 tons standard displacement shall be acquired by, or constructed by, for, or within the jurisdiction of, any of the contracting powers. And Article 6. No capital ship of any of the contracting powers shall carry a gun with a caliber in excess of 16 inches, 406 millimeters. The tables that they mention in Chapter 2 gave the French and Italians early replacement options in the late 1920s to compensate for their not being able to build new capital ships armed with 15 or 16-inch weapons. Mutsu was preserved, and the Americans got to keep Colorado and West Virginia, in addition to Maryland, which had just about completed before the start of the treaty negotiations. This ratio of 16-inch armed ships neatly mirrored the treaty displacement ratios. The British had been able to get on the playing field with two of their own new 16-inch vessels, and these would become the Nelsons. The reason for 2 rather than 3, like the US Navy, was twofold. The Colorados were just over 32,000 tons new, whereas the new British ships would be 35,000 tons, and obviously to a slightly more modern design. Plus the unspoken understanding of not demanding the scrapping of the hilariously over-the-limit Hood, which was silently standing in as the third big British capital ship. Additionally, there was a clause that allowed France and Italy to upgun their existing ships to 16-inch, if they could manage it, but this was never taken up. This, therefore, had been a relatively easy one to negotiate. The Japanese weren't happy at the ratio, but thanks to American intelligence efforts, they knew the Japanese government would accept it. Just. As there was only one class of vessels thus affected, the Nelsons, we've got to look and see if they had any quirks of design that might constitute a cheat. In this, there technically was, although unlike others that we'll see later, this was actually baked into the rules. The new standard displacement was being used to measure ships' compliance. Initially, this had been defined as the old full load, i.e. loading the ship with everything that it would have had heading out for possible combat. But the British, with French support, argued that this was a disadvantage to the imperial powers and an advantage for Italy, since British and French ships would need to go further, and thus normally they would carry more fuel and boiler feed water, thus leaving less displacement for guns, armour and machinery compared to powers with relatively little in the way of colonial commitments. Thus, the treaty definition of standard displacement was agreed as follows. Standard displacement. The standard displacement of a ship is the displacement of the ship complete, fully manned, engined and equipped for sea, including all armament and ammunition, equipment, outfit, provisions and fresh water for crew, miscellaneous stores and implements of every description that are intended to be carried in war, but without fuel or reserve feed water on board. The word ton in the present treaty, except in the expression metric tons, shall be understood to mean a ton of 2,240 pounds or 1,016 kilos. Vessels now completed shall retain their present ratings of displacement tonnage in accordance with their national system of measurement. However, a power expressing displacement in metric tons shall be considered for the application of the present treaty as owning only the equivalent displacement in tons of 2,240 pounds. A vessel completed hereafter shall be rated at its displacement tonnage when in the standard condition defined herein. This also ended up favouring the US Navy, which had to design its ships to go trans-Pacific, but with regard to the Nelsons, the Royal Navy would set about designing them with a torpedo defence system that included substantial amounts of water as a liquid layer in order to improve resilience. Normally, the considerable weight of this would count toward the overall displacement of the ship, but by ensuring that the water was theoretically able to be siphoned off for use in the boilers, it could be classed as reserve feed water and thus could be completely ignored in the standard displacement calculations. Japan would also later somewhat cheat by disarming one of the Congo class, but instead of disposing of the guns, as they were supposed to in the various sections in Chapter 2, which were referenced in various articles, as well as getting rid of fire control systems, etc., they instead placed them in storage, ready to be reinstalled at practically a moment's notice. But that was it for the battleships. Next up were the carriers, and oh boy, this one been controversial. Article 7. The total tonnage for aircraft carriers of each of the contracting powers shall not exceed, in standard displacement, for the United States, 135,000 tons. For the British Empire, 135,000 tons. For France, 60,000 tons. For Italy, 60,000 tons. And for Japan, 81,000 tons. Article 8. The replacement of aircraft carriers shall be effected only as prescribed in Chapter 2, Part 3, provided, however, that all aircraft carrier tonnage in existence or building on November 12, 1921 shall be considered experimental and may be replaced within the total tonnage limit prescribed in Article 7 without regard to its age. Article 9. No aircraft carrier exceeding 27,000 tons standard displacement shall be acquired by or constructed by, for, or within the jurisdiction of any of the contracting powers. However, any of the contracting powers may, provided that its total tonnage allowance of aircraft carriers is not thereby exceeded, build not more than 2 aircraft carriers, each of a tonnage of not more than 33,000 tons standard displacement, and in order to effect economy, any of the contracting powers may use for this purpose any 2 of their ships, whether constructed or in course of construction, which would otherwise be scrapped under the provisions of Article 2. The armament of any aircraft carriers exceeding 27,000 tons standard displacement shall be in accordance with the requirements of Article 10, except that the total number of guns to be carried in case any of such guns be of a caliber exceeding 6 inches, except anti-aircraft guns, and guns not exceeding 5 inches, shall not exceed 8. Article 10. No aircraft carrier of any of the contracting powers shall carry a gun with a caliber in excess of 8 inches, without prejudice to the provisions of Article 9. If the armament includes guns exceeding 6 inches in caliber, the total number of guns carried, except anti-aircraft guns and guns not exceeding 5 inches, shall not exceed 10. If, alternatively, the armament contains no guns exceeding 6 inches in caliber, the number of guns is not limited. In either case, the number of anti-aircraft guns and of guns not exceeding 5 inches is not limited. This was a huge change from earlier proposals. The Royal Navy had come into the conference thinking they needed 5 carriers of around 25,000 tons apiece, so they naturally suggested a 125,000 ton displacement limit. The US Navy, on the other hand, really only cared about converting Lexington and Saratoga, and so they went for 80,000 tons as the upper limit, hoping to get 2 40,000 ton carriers out of it. And they also wanted the same ratio split of tonnage as for battleships. Literally everybody else present objected to this idea. Individual carriers at 40,000 tons made something of a mockery of the 35,000 ton limit on battleships. The Americans, of course, favoured something in this region because of the battlecruiser conversions that they were planning. Lacking hulls of that size of their own, the UK and France were pressing for 25,000 tons as the limit, which would of course have made the Lexington conversions completely impossible. Italy pointed out that with an 80,000 ton upper limit for the US and the UK, France and Italy would be left with only enough displacement for a single decent-sized carrier, whereas for operational reasons they wanted to have at least 2. The British also pointed out that if submarines were not to be banned, then low numbers of carriers were a significantly bad idea, since carrier-borne aircraft would probably be needed to counter submarines, which turned out to be a relatively far-sighted comment. Japan was on board with this particular idea, since their allocation would have left them with a single carrier and a little left over for a ship so small that it wouldn't actually be a carrier under the proposed definition, which treated carriers as ships over 10,000 tons. Thus, they argued for a displacement allocation equivalent to 3 carriers at 27,000 tons apiece, which was a figure being increasingly discussed as the standard carrier displacement, offering to allow the US and UK to up their own limits in line with this if they wanted a proportional split. The British, seeing that proposal's figures line up pretty much with what they wanted them to, supported this and proposed a tonnage limit that, using the 27,000 ton carrier as a base, reflected France and Italy having 2 carriers, the Japanese having 3, and the US and the UK having 5. France then made a last-minute bid to up their allocation from 54,000 tons to 75,000 tons to allow them to get 3 25,000-ton carriers. Everyone glared at them, and a compromise of 60,000 tons was offered, which allowed the two smaller navies to choose between 3 slightly smaller carriers of around 20,000 tons, or 2 standard carriers with a bit of spare displacement left over. This was agreed, with 3 significant concessions. One put forward by the British drew a line under all existing carriers, which therefore classed them as experimental and able to be replaced at any time. This meant that their weird and wonderful collection of Argus, Eagle, Hermes, etc. could be cleared out in favour of newer, larger ships whenever funds were available, and they were happy with the various lessons learned from their operation. The other 2 modifications were sponsored mostly by the US. The first was an exception of 2 vessels which could hit 33,000 tons, basically to allow for the conversion of the battle cruisers, and the other was provision for a limited number of 8-inch guns to allow for self-defence from the newer cruisers coming online, that were going to be armed with similar weapons. There was also the definition of an aircraft carrier, which is as follows. Aircraft carrier. An aircraft carrier is defined as a vessel of war with a displacement in excess of 10,000 tons, standard displacement, designed for the specific and exclusive purpose of carrying aircraft. It must be so constructed that aircraft can be launched therefrom and land thereon, and not designed or constructed for carrying a more powerful armament than that allowed to it under Article 9 or Article 10, as the case may be. In terms of cheating on this particular aspect of the treaty, Japan ostensibly actually managed to get Akagi and Kaga, which was a Tosa-class conversion substituted in after an earthquake warped the hull of Amagi, down to just under the 27,000-ton upper limit. So that was good. But they'd later seek to exploit the definition of carrier itself by constructing what was to have been the first of a class of light carriers, coming in just a hair under 10,000 tons. This ship would end up being Rugio, which, as designed, technically wasn't a carrier, and thus could have been built indefinitely. As it turned out, Rugio ended up over 10,000 tons anyway, and the loophole would be closed by the 1930 London Naval Treaty in any case. The Americans turned out to be the biggest cheats in this category, as even with the 33,000-ton allowance, their engineers simply couldn't find a way to drop the Lexington's displacement much under 36,000 tons, and so they took advantage of another subsidiary clause that read, "No retained capital ships or aircraft carriers shall be reconstructed except for the purpose of providing means of defence against air and submarine attack, and subject to the following rules. The contracting powers may, for that purpose, equip existing tonnage with bulge or blister or anti-air attack deck protection, providing the increase of displacement thus affected does not exceed 3,000 tons displacement for each ship." This clause was clearly intended to allow rebuilds of older ships, notice retained capital ships or aircraft carriers, not ones that was going to be constructed after the treaty was signed. But the US Navy decided on a creative interpretation of the clause and simply allocated every single ounce of anti-aircraft and torpedo defence being built into the carriers to this particular clause, and then listed the default standard displacement at 33,000 tons exactly, with a footnote saying the following. This does not include weight allowances under Chapter 11, Part 3, Section 1, Article D of Washington Treaty for providing means against air and submarine attack. This was, of course, a complete cheat on the treaty, because, as new-built ships, the Lexingtons were not supposed to be granted this additional 3,000 tons displacement. But by the time it all rolled around, no one was particularly bothered. As far as the British were concerned, they had planned and hoped for 5 25,000-ton carriers, so having displacement to build 5 at 27,000 tons was perfectly fine with them, especially as they'd get to play around with their existing conversions and replace them with newer, larger ships whenever they pretty much wanted. Technically, they could have built a pair of carriers based on the G3 designs using the same provision that allowed for Lexington, Saratoga, Akagi, and Kaga. But they had no particular desire to. Apart from immediate cost, they had determined, correctly as it turned out, that a 27,000-ton purpose-built carrier designed with the lessons of operating existing vessels in mind would be a better vessel than a theoretical 33,000-ton battleship conversion. For an example of that, look at the relative operational efficiencies of Lexington and Saratoga versus the Yorktown, Enterprise and Hornet, which were of considerably less displacement but could actually carry more aircraft. Cruisers and other small craft got a mere 2 paragraphs. Article 11. No vessel of war exceeding 10,000 tons standard displacement other than a capital ship or aircraft carrier shall be acquired by or constructed by, for, or within the jurisdiction of any of the contracting powers. Vessels not specifically built as fighting ships, nor taken in time of peace under government control for fighting purposes, which are employed on fleet duties or as troop transports or in some other way for the purpose of assisting in the prosecution of hostilities otherwise than as fighting ships, shall not be within the limitations of this article. Article 12. No vessel of war of any of the contracting powers hereafter laid down, other than a capital ship, shall carry a gun with a calibre in excess of 8 inches, or 203 millimetres. For all its brevity, this short section reflected more of a failure of negotiation than any common agreement. The discussions in this area had 2 main facets. The limits of 10,000 tons per ship and 8-inch guns were pretty easily agreed to by all. No one had actually built a cruiser to that scale yet, so there seemed to be plenty of room for growth. Something that's quite amusing given a lot of the later issues that would arise in regard to this particular restriction. However, that's where easy negotiation ended. The US wanted total tonnage limits like those imposed on the larger ship allowances, and with similar ratios being applied. France absolutely refused to a similar ratio as its capital ship allowance, citing its imperial commitments, and Britain, with empire and trade to protect, wanted absolutely nothing to do with total tonnage limits. With the Japanese and Italians looking on in quiet bemusement, the 2 imperial powers were completely intransigent, to a degree that the US delegation quietly dropped the proposals as not even worth negotiating on, which would leave cruisers and destroyers completely open-ended as a field outside of those 2 basic requirements. There was one additional issue, which was the French really wanted to build lots of destroyers, since they now couldn't compete with the Royal Navy in terms of capital ships. Of course, even with relatively simple requirements, this was going to be one of the most violated aspects of the treaty. 2 of the signatories, Italy and Japan, gave building 10,000-ton 8-inch armed cruisers a go, decided this was stupid, and simply lied about the tonnage of any cruisers that they built going forward. France and the US made fairly creditable attempts at sticking to the limits, even when this resulted in ships like the Duquesne and Pensacola classes, whose protection against anything more than a stiff breeze could best be described as optimistic. The British, in an early example of fitting for, but not with, would go on to build the County class, which adhered very well to the displacement limits, but seemed rather oddly protected, with fairly heavy armour around the magazines and not really anywhere else. But once the treaty system collapsed in the late 1930s, the speed and precision with which these ships had the intervening space filled in with additional armour with surprisingly little overall effect on their sailing capabilities, reflected perhaps this unspoken design feature had in fact been there from the start. There were similar levels of intransigent behaviour from the French when it came to submarines. As we said before, with the limit on capital ships, they saw their only hope of staying within reach of the Royal Navy being a large fleet of submarines and destroyers, and so that meant that restrictions on those kinds of vessels weren't even considered. The British had been more open to limits on destroyers, but as long as submarines were going to be permitted at all, let alone unregulated, they absolutely refused to back anything more concrete, and so both destroyers and submarines would go completely unmentioned in the treaty. Something that would lead to considerable degrees of experimentation in the field of submarines in the 1920s and early 1930s. The next few sections of the treaty were something of a grab bag of miscellaneous issues. Article 13. Except as provided in Article 9, no ship designated in the present treaty to be scrapped may be reconverted into a vessel of war. Looking at you, Japan. Article 14. No preparations shall be made in merchant ships in times of peace for the installation of warlike armaments for the purpose of converting such ships into vessels of war, other than the necessary stiffening of decks for the mounting of guns not exceeding 6-inch calibre. Article 15. No vessel of war constructed within the jurisdiction of any of the contracting powers for a non-contracting power shall exceed the limitations as to displacement and armament prescribed by the present treaty for vessels of a similar type which may be constructed by or for any of the contracting powers, providing, however, that the displacement for aircraft carriers constructed for a non-contracting power shall in no case exceed 27,000 ton standard displacement. Article 16. If the construction of any vessel of war for a non-contracting power is undertaken within the jurisdiction of any of the contracting powers, such power shall promptly inform the other contracting powers of the date of the signing of the contract and the date on which the keel of the ship is laid, and shall also communicate to them the particulars relating to the ship prescribed in Chapter 2, Part 3, Section 1b, 4 and 5. Article 17. In the event of a contracting power being engaged in war, such power shall not use as a vessel of war any vessel of war which may be under construction within its jurisdiction for any other power, or which may have been constructed within its jurisdiction for another power and not delivered. Article 18. Each of the contracting powers undertakes not to dispose by gift, sale, or any mode of transfer of any vessel of war in such a manner that such vessel may become a vessel of war in the navy of any foreign power. Articles 13 and 14 were pretty simple and largely aimed to prevent merchant ships being built that were actually just cruisers in disguise. 15 and 16 were a general attempt to ensure that the five big powers couldn't just do an end run around the treaty by building a treaty-breaking ship for a third party who might just happen to ally with them in the event of the next war. For example, Britain building an N3 or G3 for the Royal Australian Navy as and when Australia became fully independent, or the US building large capital ships for South American countries with clauses allowing them to buy back the ship in the event of a war. 17 and 18, however, were more of a Britain, this means you set of clauses, since, of course, the Royal Navy had significantly boosted its numbers at the start of World War I by buying, or seizing, a number of battleships, cruisers and destroyers intended for other countries. This is what Clause 17 sought to prevent, whilst Clause 18 was another way of stopping anyone, but especially Britain, from building and gifting warships to other allied navies, like the Royal Australian Navy or the Royal Canadian Navy, and to prevent a situation like that of Goeben, which of course had been transferred to the Ottoman Empire. Apart from anything else, the treaty aimed to establish a balance of power that would be sustainable, and this was hardly going to work if Britain, the power with the largest number and most modern ships to dispose of, decided to flog off squadrons of battleships like the Orions, or battlecruisers like Lion and Princess Royal, to friendly nations like Chile or the aforementioned Dominions, for 3 shillings and a cup of tea each. Article 20 referred simply to the new standardised way of determining tonnage, but 19, the remaining section, was the single longest and most complex clause. Article 19. The United States, the British Empire, and Japan agreed that the status quo at the time of the signing of the present treaty, with regard to fortifications and naval bases, shall be maintained in their respective territories and possessions specified hereunder. 1. The insular possessions which the United States now holds or may hereafter acquire in the Pacific Ocean, except A. those adjacent to the coast of the United States, Alaska, and the Panama Canal Zone, not including the Aleutian Islands, and B. the Hawaiian Islands. 2. Hong Kong and the insular possessions which the British Empire now holds or may hereafter acquire in the Pacific Ocean, east of the meridian of 1100 east longitude, except A. those adjacent to the coast of Canada, B. the Commonwealth of Australia and its territories, and C. New Zealand. 3. The following insular territories and possessions of Japan in the Pacific Ocean, to wit, the Kurile Islands, the Bonin Islands, Amami Oshima, the Lochu Islands, Formosa, and the Pescadores, and any insular territories or possessions in the Pacific Ocean which Japan may hereafter acquire. The maintenance of the status quo under the foregoing provisions implies that no new fortifications or naval bases shall be established in the territories and possessions specified, that no measures shall be taken to increase the existing naval facilities for the repair and maintenance of naval forces, and that no increase shall be made in the coast defence of the territories and possessions above specified. This restriction, however, does not preclude such repair and replacement of worn-out weapons and equipment as is customary in naval and military establishments in time of peace. The short version was that this meant no massively fortified naval bases in the Philippines or Hong Kong for the US and the UK respectively. Whilst it did also restrict the Japanese navy, it broadly suited the Japanese, since after all their navy was based right in the middle of this zone and would force the main bases of the other two navies to be, at best, located in Pearl Harbor and Singapore respectively, which was well away from anything Japan might want to do in the immediate future. The rest of the treaty consists of tables showing which ships are going to be retained, when they could be replaced, and a few other clauses concerning the duration of the treaty, provisions for the outbreak of war that involved a signatory, and procedures for withdrawal. The most immediate effects were the massive scrapping and conversion schemes of all the navies involved. France and Italy would actually end up underutilising their allowances as economic issues caused further scrapping in the later part of the 1920s, but a lot of the unanswered questions would lead to various loopholes being sought and exploited to one degree or another, some of which we've already mentioned, like small aircraft carriers, but others would come to include cruiser submarines, increasingly large destroyers, and the like. Many of these would therefore need to be addressed in subsequent treaties, such as the London Naval Treaty almost a decade later, but these simply modified and added conditions to the overall original Washington Agreement. They didn't actually replace it wholesale. And as a result, it was under the withdrawal terms of this treaty that the whole system began to break down in the mid-1930s, before being ended in 1936 without any renewal. So, who won and who lost out of this? Well, probably the single largest winners were the Italians. They got basically everything they asked for, they stopped everything they'd objected to, and they got to sit at the same level as the French Navy, which was something that, well, A, they wanted, and B, the French didn't like, which, to be honest, the French not liking it was almost as much a driver as the fact that the Italians did. The French kind of won, but also kind of shot themselves in the foot, in as much as they managed to negotiate for a considerably larger battle fleet in terms of capital ships, and obviously no restrictions on numbers of cruisers, destroyers and submarines, etc., than it turned out they could actually afford. So quite how they were going to plan on funding some of the more wild and grandiose claims that they'd made during the conference, who knows? But it meant that they actually ended up having a lot of spare and redundant space in their treaty allocations right up until the middle of the 1930s, when, ironically enough, they actually technically started laying down ships like the Dunkirk and Richelieu just a fraction too early. But by that point the treaty system was collapsing anyway, so nobody particularly cared beyond a few diplomatic protests. In terms of the big three at the table, the United States undoubtedly came out pretty much on top in most of their wishes going into the Washington Conference. They managed to break up the Anglo-Japanese alliance, as not renewing it was part of the subsidiary terms. They also managed to get their battle fleet to parity levels with the Royal Navy in both battleships and carriers. Without firing a shot, they'd managed to pull themselves up to the same level as a navy that had prided itself on being the biggest and the best by a considerable margin for well over 100 years. They'd also managed to argue for the Lexington and Saratoga, which would give them the two single best aircraft carriers of the period. They'd managed to close off most of the obvious potential loopholes that would have allowed Britain to covertly build up a larger battle fleet than it by sending ships or selling ships to the various dominions and other friendly powers that it might have. And it had allowed them to retain a balance of force over the Japanese Navy, which they knew the Japanese didn't think they could win a war against the US with. And of course, for the isolationist US government of the time, it meant they didn't have to pay through the nose for fantastically more expensive US battleships, cruisers, battlecruisers, etc. As far as the British were concerned, the big wins were being able to build the two Nelson class, which theoretically would give them the most advanced battleships in the world, even if there were only two, and they managed to distract everyone else from the existence of Hood enough that no one had asked them to scrap it. They also had somewhat more carrier provision than they thought they would, which meant that in an ideal world, without the various constraints of, the Great Depression and rapidly advancing technology, they could potentially have pulled off a fleet of 6 Ark Royal-style carriers within their treaty displacement limits, which arguably would have been, had they been properly kitted out with air wings, a somewhat better fleet to have than the 2 Lexington, 2 Yorktown Ranger plus Wasp that the US was left with before, obviously, the treaty system started to break down. There were also no limits on cruisers, which allowed the Royal Navy to, theoretically at least, plan to have enough cruisers on station across the world. But, of course, they hadn't been able to ban submarines. They were now not going to be able to hive off some of their ships such as Tiger when it came up for replacement to the Australian and Canadian navies, thus allowing it to get back above the US Navy in terms of overall numbers. And of course it was now one of 2 big navies on the block rather than the biggest navy, with perhaps a strong contender following close behind. They also no longer had the Anglo-Japanese Naval Treaty, which further cut into their strategic calculations. And as it would start to rapidly become clear, the limit on cruisers of 10,000 tons and 8-inch guns, whilst it had suited them at the time because they rather wanted to retain the Hawkins class, turned out to be something of a thorn in their heel, since everybody else immediately started building cruisers to this maximum limit, and the Royal Navy would really much rather everyone had stuck to around 5,000 to 6,000 tons, because the Royal Navy could build a lot of 5,000 to 6,000 ton cruisers and thus have cruisers all over the place. But there was no point in building lots of these smaller cruisers when everyone else was building cruisers almost twice the size, which would substantially outgun your smaller colonial cruisers. And so the Royal Navy was faced with a harsh choice between having enough cruisers, but having them easy to beat up, or having big and powerful cruisers, but never having enough of them. And finally, the Japanese. Like the British, they had lost the Anglo-Japanese alliance, which meant their overall balance of strategic forces when looking at the Americans had been somewhat reduced, and they were now left with a navy whose theoretical battle line size was not able to face off against the American battle line in the manner in which they'd wanted. However, the fact that there were no overall limits on the numbers of cruisers and destroyers that they could build meant that they could immediately start looking to revise their Kantai-Kessen doctrine to the one that should be familiar with to most students of World War II, involving massive attritional attacks by torpedo-equipped cruisers and destroyers, which they could build to pretty much their heart's content. Indeed, some of the aspects of the Washington Naval Treaty, especially with regard to fleet size, would be some of the major driving factors behind the development of things like the Long Lance torpedo. Where they could consider that they had one was that they were now officially the 3rd largest navy and the sole occupant of Tier 2 on the global power stage, which was a significant advance as to where they'd been pre-World War I, and they could wind down the ruinously expensive naval budget somewhat. Whilst some people in the Navy found this a little bit disappointing, various more level-headed individuals like Admiral Yamamoto realised that the Japanese economy was on a train wreck to nowhere fairly quickly if they'd kept up the original levels of expenditure, and so he was actually relatively relieved. The other big wins for the Japanese were the ability to retain Mutsu, which was a huge public morale issue, and also the fact that the other 2 big powers had managed to be negotiated into agreeing not to fortify anything near Japan, which, as we said earlier, gave Japan pretty much free rein to do what it liked in the immediate vicinity of Japan, something that it would exploit ruthlessly when it came to various military adventures over the next couple of decades. But we have already mentioned many of the loopholes, if not the outright abuses of the treaty that would arise over the next 6 to 8 years, and so it wouldn't be too long before, after an abortive conference in Geneva, everyone would be back in London in the 1930s to discuss further limitations. But that's a story for another time.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.